Welcome, everyone. I'm Sister Louise Lears, and it's my privilege to work on creation care advocacy for the Franciscan Action Network. I welcome you to the first of our three-part series, Working for Environmental Justice. I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Franciscan Federation, the Sisters of St. Francis of Philadelphia, and the Order of Friars Minor, Holy Name Province, Justice, Peace, Integrity of Creation Office. As always, we begin with prayer, and I invite Sister Joan Brown of New Mexico Interfaith Power and Light and Sister Pat Millen of the Franciscan Federation to lead us in prayer.
Blessings, everyone. Good afternoon. I'd like to offer a blessing and acknowledgement of place. And this particular blessing acknowledgement is one that we often use here in New Mexico. And it came from a group that I'm part of called Communities for Clean Water, which includes women from San Ildefonso and Santa Clara Pueblo and Tewa women. So the word that I will use, the lands that I live on, is the Tewa peoples, but you may just exchange that word for whatever the place is that you live, and the indigenous people whose homeland that is. Everyone here is walking, living, and breathing within these sacred lands of the Tewa peoples. Let us fully acknowledge where we are and give thanks for living mountains, valleys, and waters, which sustain our lives and form Tewa ancestral homelands and those of all land-based peoples. Let us ground our activities in awareness of where we are, and may the mannerisms of the Tewa peoples enter our lives and fill us with gratitude, love, care, and respect for all that is shared between us and all beings.
And I offer this prayer for Native Americans. God of all creation, from the direction where the sun sets, from the direction of cleansing power, from the direction of the rising sun, and from the direction of the middle of the day, we come to you this day to ask for your blessing. Bless and protect Native peoples over all the earth. Give them integrity so that their words and actions are one. Give them listening hearts so that they are able to hear and learn from each other. Give them wisdom and understanding to learn from their past, live faithfully in the present, and co-create a future with you, O God, so that all people live free from fear and violence. God of our ancestors, we are thankful for your many blessings. We pray for all people, especially for the children, the sick, the dying. We pray for those in military service, that no harm will come to them. We pray for our enemies, that one day your peace and healing will unite us all. Throughout our lives, may we walk hand in hand with you, our loving God, honoring your land, caring for your creation, and respecting all your people. We pray and ask for your blessing through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Sisters Joan and Pat. This is the first in our series, Working for Environmental Justice. We know that some people suffer far more than others from the effects of climate change, especially people of Indigenous, Black, Brown, and low-wealth communities. Today, we turn our attention to efforts for environmental justice in two regions of New Mexico, Chaco Canyon and the Permian Basin. We're planning on a total of 75 minutes, concluding no later than 5:15 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll start with a short presentation, a visual presentation of Chaco Canyon and the Permian Basin. And then I have the privilege of having a conversation with 5 wonderful frontline activists in New Mexico who will help us with 3 things in particular. What are the issues? What's being done now? And how can we support their efforts? After our panel conversation, we want to hear from you. And we ask that you put your question into the Q&A box in the bottom of your screen. And Janine Walsh, our communications coordinator, will gather those questions and pose them to our panelists. And you can direct your question to one person on the panel or to the panel in general. So we'll start with this short visual presentation of Chaco Canyon and the Permian Basin. Chaco Canyon is in the northwest part of the state, indicated by the red arrow in the top left of your screen. The Permian Basin is diagonally opposite in the southeast part of the state. For over 2,000 years, Pueblo peoples occupied a vast region of New Mexico, with Chaco Canyon as a center of ancestral Pueblo culture. Pueblo Bonito is the largest and best-known great house in Chaco Canyon. Ancestral Puebloans occupied Pueblo Bonito between around AD 828 and 1126. These symbolically important and beautiful artifacts were found in a crypt of Pueblo Bonito. Nuevo Alto is a great house built in the last part of the 12th century, at a time when the Chacoan population was declining. Spirals and other designs are still found at Chaco, probably serving to mark events and remind people of sacred stories. The Permian Basin is home to the highest emitting oil and gas project in the United States and one of the largest oil fields in the world. Here we see one oil rig of many in the foreground against the background of a magnificent New Mexico sky. The Permian Basin is treated as a sacrifice zone, causing pollution, which impacts the health of those who have contributed the least to pollution and yet suffer the most. Extracting oil and gas trapped in shale underground requires enormous amounts of chemicals and water, and the toxic wastewater must be disposed of or stored in some way. Gas flaring is the burning of unwanted gas, and it's poised to increase in the Permian Basin in 2024. And I wonder what this young boy is thinking. And here we see climate activists marching in Albuquerque for environmental justice. And that's the perfect segue to a conversation with our frontline activists, some of whom may be marching in this. And I call on them to join us. Sister Joan Brown, the Franciscan sister working in New Mexico with Interfaith Power and Light. Marcelia Isais Gastelum is a community outreach organizer with Renew Mexico and board member of New Mexico Interfaith Power and Light. Terry Sloan is a member of the Church of the Risen Savior in Albuquerque and board member of New Mexico Interfaith Power and Light. Josie Dominguez Zuniga is a community organizer with Citizens Caring for the Future, Carlsbad, and Kaylee Shoup is a community organizer with Citizens Caring for the Future, Carlsbad. And we are so grateful for your advocacy for environmental justice, and we look forward to hearing about your efforts and about what we can do to support your efforts, to amplify your efforts. Right? Sister Joan, I'd like to start with you. I heard you speak of New Mexico as a sacrifice state. Can you help us understand what that means and how that affects advocacy for environmental justice?
Yes, thanks so much, Louise. And again, it's just wonderful to be here and to have the team from New Mexico here that works so hard on these concerns with our communities and our land of enchantment, which is a sacrifice zone and has been for quite some time. So when we say sacrifice zone, actually that word was coined during the Cold War around nuclear weapons, nuclear waste, uranium mining, and it was said to be places that were so polluted from radiation and nuclear that they were toxic and devastated, inhospitable. But we, in our modern times now, have really expanded that to mean areas like in our state that have the nuclear, but also have oil and gas. And so those are areas that affect the health of people, the land itself, the water, the creatures. And I guess I like to look at it in terms of something from Laudato Si. Pope Francis talks about throwaway cultures or throwaway people. Well, that's basically what sacrifice zones are. It's this attitude that maybe nobody really lives there. It's a rural area, or maybe it's an area that's in an urban place where people, there's great economic inequity. And so we still have this attitude, and many of us who are Christians even, or of other faith traditions, that some people are more important than others. And I guess I like to look at some of this going back, and this fits with Catholics especially, to the doctrine of discovery, which was a doctrine that allowed for, colonizers, including friars, Jesuits, Franciscans, my tradition, Fan's tradition, to come and take over lands for governments in Europe, because they considered the people that lived there not people because they weren't Christians. It was sort of like it was empty lands. And so in some ways, I think we continue to carry some of that mentality of some areas, places are more important than others. And here in New Mexico, in some ways, we say that the whole state almost is a sacrifice zone, because from the map that you showed, the Northwest to the Southeast and other areas as well, because of the pollution and devastation from extractivism. And then I guess I'd like to take it one step further. Recently, I was at a hearing with the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and that hearing was addressing greenhouse gas emissions and methane pollution in the oil and gas regions in our state. And it occurred to me that what we're doing to our common home is really creating a sacrifice zone of the entire planet. And we have seen the effects of that with climate change this summer, and now the floods, the droughts, the health implications for people, the heat, people dying from heat. One of our board members who lives in El Paso last night, Cynthia, was speaking about how 2 young people just died this last week from heat in that region. So these kind of things are the consequences of creating sacrifice zones, where we don't see, as Pope Francis says, everything, everyone is all one, and that all is sacred. And so because of that, we need to change our attitudes, see our oneness. And in terms of advocacy, that calls us to act as brothers and sisters, as kin, and in solidarity for what is needed and what the frontline communities in those particular areas really want and are calling us to join them with.
Joan, you mentioned the doctrine of discovery, and I think that's something that's maybe new to some people. So can you just do a brief explanation? Because you also mentioned that it's still in our environment, it's still in our mentality.
Yes, I really believe it is. And And so I'm talking a little louder. We were suddenly having a lot of rain here, which I don't know if everybody
Rain in
else can
New
hear it,
Mexico.
but I'm trying to talk above the rain, which in our region is a blessing. Terry would talk more about that. In the Hopi, it's the ancestors' blessing. It's the, blessings. So we're having blessings right now. But the doctrine of discovery comes from papal bulls that began around the time of the conquest of European countries to other countries or to other places in the world, like Spain, for instance. And excuse me. So it was a way of taking land. It was called empty land. You could take it. And because the people that lived there were not Christian. So it was two opportunities. One, to Christianize indigenous people, and the other was to take the land. And I recently heard an African-American theologian who was from Africa speaking, and he had a very good statement that I just really appreciated. And he said, so the missionaries came in, they taught us to pray. They said, close your eyes and let us pray. We closed our eyes to pray. We opened our eyes and we had Christianity, but we had no land. And so the intent was of that time. It was a different time, but I think we're called now to heal that, to change our attitudes. And that attitude filters into the legal system still. There have been cases that have been won still on that within as recently as maybe 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And it's still in people's thinking. So I still remember a hearing that I went to with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission regarding a nuclear site that they want to put for waste for all the nuclear power plants around the country in the Permian Basin, near where Josie and Kaylee live. And I was ready to give my testimony. The gentleman before me, and he was not from here, spoke and he said, this is the best place to put all this nuclear waste because nobody lives there.
Right.
And so when it was my next turn to speak, I prefaced what I was saying regarding this facility to say, we still have this attitude of the doctrine of discovery, or that nobody lives there. Lots of people live there. Creatures live there. Everyone is our kin, our brother and sister, and we cannot say that.
Thank you, Sister
It's a big
Joan.
attitude shift that has to happen. And I think it has to happen in order for us to even in advocacy to work in solidarity and truly see one another as one, as Pope Francis calls us to be.
Thank you. Thank you. Terry, you've worked particularly in the Chaco Canyon area. And recently, Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland ruled that there'd be no new oil and gas leases within a 10-mile radius of Chaco Canyon for the next 20 years. Now, this all sounds good. Can you comment on that ruling and how does it impact your efforts?
Thank you, Louise, and thank you, everybody, for those prayers and land acknowledgement. That was fantastic. It was great to hear. When I heard of the ruling by Secretary Haaland, who is a friend of mine, I was ecstatic. We celebrated. We were happy. Many of us, had fought for it for a long time. Personally, myself, I started whispering in United States Senator, New Mexico Senator Tom Udall's ear in 2014 and 15 that we needed protection of the Chaco Canyon. So there was previous precedent that was provided by Tom Udall and of course with partnership with Senator Martin Heinrich, which created the Chaco Cultural Heritage Area Protection Act. And so there was an attempt in 2018 to get that act passed, but it didn't get passed because it was pulled back by Senator Tom Udall to add additional consideration from our Chaco area stakeholders. Some of the tribal members, of course, and then of course other organizations wanted additional wording, so it was pulled back. And So we've still been waiting on that now for about 5 years. But when Secretary Holland passed this ruling, it was a big step for us. It has been a long held belief, of course, that many of you know and don't know, that Native Indigenous peoples care for the land, love the land, Mother Earth. And to many, there is a strong desire to protect our revered sacred sites, such as Chaco Canyon. It is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So many of us, as I've mentioned, have fought for environmental justice for Chaco Canyon. It is a very, very revered sacred site by many, the Navajos, the Puebloans, even the indigenous peoples of Mexico, came up. It is believed it was populated by hundreds of thousands of people at one time, the area and the region. And so it wasn't empty or nobody lived there at one point. It was like a center of the universe, in a sense, for the Puebloan and Native Indigenous peoples in this region. So a lot of us have seen that, and many, Native and non-Native people have done that. And so we have been working to try to protect this site. And so with this ruling by Secretary Holland, that just moved us closer to that environmental justice that many of us were seeking. We of course were seeking to protect it, from the desecration and destruction and fracking that have occurred in the region, and it's been bad. We've had fires and explosions, and I've worked with people that have survived these fires and explosions that have happened in the region. And personally, I've driven past the area because I'm an accountant by profession, and we had a client in Shiprock, New Mexico, and so I drove that 550 road for like 20 years. So I saw the growth and the development of the oil and gas industry in that region, and it just hurt my heart to see this. And then, of course, with the client, we took tours on their construction work, and I actually drove by and got to look at some of the desecration and destruction up close, because we drove past some of the oil and, the platforms, the pumping stations, etc., and got to see it and how, it was creating a mess. The concern was that it was going to seep into the underground water, into the aquifer below. And so those were major concerns by us, and many of us, especially the indigenous peoples in that region. So again, this really helped us to help see that protection become a reality close. But again, what we're hoping for this year, because it's been reintroduced, is by our current congressional delegation, is the Cultural Heritage Area Protection Act 2023 was reintroduced to Congress. And so we're hoping that will get close to passage. And that includes a 10-mile buffer zone, which we think is adequate. But in reality, when we were first working on protecting Chaco, we asked for a 20-mile buffer zone.
Right.
And then we compromised and brought it down to 15, and then there was more, blah, blah, blah. So then we finally brought it down to 10. So 10 is what we have right now. Of course, there's pushback from the Navajo Nation, and of course from the Alatis that have, interests in the oil and gas development in that area. But I think part of the problem is just educating them on what's happening.
Right. So, Jerry, you just might explain. You mentioned Alatis, who may be affected by this. So can you just explain to us what some of us may not know what that means?
Yes, and Alati is what this area is actually called a checkerboard area, because it consists of federal land, state land, private land, and tribal land. And it's just there's no forethought on how this would be created, but there's just pieces of land here and there and blah blah blah. And so within this land, there's our Navajo Nation Alatis who received land from Congress years ago as part of a settlement in their relocation. So they have parcels of land around Chaco Canyon. And so what some of them have done is they have leased out their land to the oil and gas companies for development. And so their biggest fear is that with this ruling by Secretary Holland, or even the Chaco Cultural Heritage Area Protection Act, is that they will lose royalties, or their royalties will be diminished, or be affected by these lands, by these rulings. But the understanding that they're missing here is that these are just only affecting public lands, not private land, tribal land, or state land. So those lands are okay. They're not touched by it, but it only affects public land. So that's what the Alatis are, is they're Navajo Nation tribal members, and of course their interest is the oil and gas revenues that are occurring from their lands.
Sure. Thank you, Terry. Thanks very much. And as you said, it affects only federal lands, not state lands and not tribal lands, not private lands. And it only affects, my understanding is, new gas and oil leases. So the existing ones continue. It's those that are new. Right. Josie, the Permian Basin is, as we said, the highest emitting oil and gas project in the country. So in your experience, how does the pollution affect the land and the air and the people? What's the impact?
I think that the land and the people and the air, I think that we're all interconnected. And so when these things are happening outside of our homes, our water is being contaminated, our air is being contaminated. In the Permian Basin, more specifically the Eddy County area, several times this year alone, we've already hit the EPA's legal limit of air pollution that certain areas are allowed to have. And in retrospect, this is such a small area to be hitting that cap for air pollution. And when you think about it, you have to consider the amount of methane that's being emitted from such a small area and what that might be doing to the people. I can speak from experience that people in these areas, my own neighbors, are getting sick. We're seeing people show up with cancers that haven't been previously recorded in this area. Asthma rates are increasing. I mean, personally, I developed asthma around 16, 17 years old. I'd never had issues like that before. There are lots of little things that you begin noticing when you take a look into these communities, and you start seeing that people are getting sick, and they're only going to get sicker, especially with production increasing this upcoming year.
And you mentioned methane, Josie, and methane, my understanding anyway, is really dangerous, far more dangerous than CO2 emitted into the air. Is that accurate?
I don't think I can accurately answer that, but I can answer that the methane we have emitting here is creating a hole in the ozone that's been spotted by NASA using their satellites. And I think that's a pretty good indicator to see just how dangerous it is in such a small area.
Yeah, that is. Thank you, Josie, very much. Kaylee, we'll stay in the Permian Basin here. So some might wonder, is there any hope for making a difference? I mean, we saw the pictures of those oil rig regions that laid out in that large amount of territory. And so what's your response about the hope for reclaiming the land and the water and the air?
Yeah, well, I'm going to start by kind of addressing the methane question, actually.
Thank you.
So methane, it is much stronger than CO2 and warms the planet at a much stronger rate. But it does not stay in the atmosphere quite as long as CO2. So when we cut methane pollution, it's one of the most effective levers we have to really cut the emissions on our atmosphere, to hopefully stay below that 1.5 threshold and to really make a dent in the amount of warming that we're seeing. So here in the Permian Basin, of course, on the front lines, we really want to see emissions cut because of all the dangerous things that come with them, like volatile organic compounds, things like benzene that are making people sick. But also there's a vested interest for the entire world to really take notice of this area because we are really doing a lot of damage to our entire planet. But I will go back to your question now. So first of all, I want to say—
You just wander around all you want.
First of all, I want to say thank you to all of you for being here today and hearing our stories, as I really think that being in community and sharing stories with one another is how we're going to walk through this really dark period in time that I think our planet is just really stepping into and beginning the journey we're beginning to take. And Joan and Josie both said this, just the interconnectedness of us all. And I think being in spaces like this and making it a point to be aware of our interconnectedness and acknowledge and learn from others is really how we will begin to address these issues that we face. So again, thank you all for being here. So I will admittedly say that I have a really hard time having hope living where I live. As Luis mentioned, this is the most active oil field in the country, and production just continues to rise and rise and rise, even as we're seeing our climate in such turmoil. And it seems that this summer even, we're just hitting all these tipping points. And I think all of us, no matter who you are at this point, your political affiliation, you really can't ignore what's happening in the world and to people. And so it's really disheartening to see that we're just continuing to drill and drill and drill. I am going to go into reasons why I do have hope, but I just do want to say that I think it's really important to acknowledge reality and to also properly grieve as we're going through this as a planet, because there are places that we are going to lose because of climate change and environmental pollution. And I think a lot of the time when you think of those places, you think of places that will be wiped out by natural disasters or rising seawaters. But I also think the places where a lot of this extraction has happened, where all of this environmental pollution is going on, they're going to be lost too. They're going to be sucked dried. We will run out of water. It'll be uninhabitably hot. So the Permian is one of those places where that could very possibly happen. So I just want to acknowledge that reality before I get into the reasons why I do think there is hope. And I'm going to actually just break it down piece by piece, because for me, kind of what I've learned in the past 2 years doing this work is that I can't look at the whole problem, right? Because if I do, then it's just, how do you face it? What do? You really just have to break it down to your community, to one thing. And you have to really learn and practice that diligently. And so I'm going to start with air. I do have hope that we will reclaim our air and cut down on air pollution. A big part of that hope is because, as I mentioned, the world has a vested interest in the air pollution in this region going down. And so I think there will be a lot of technology produced. And then also, I do not want us to think that will get us out of the woods by any means. I also hope that eventually we will begin to take meaningful steps to phase out fossil fuel production as a nation. And so I really do have hope that that's something, and that really is something that we can address, and that I think we will. In terms of land, that is something else that I think there is a vested interest in the country taking a look at that and making sure that we do reclaim the land here. And I say that because it will create a lot of jobs to clean up these oil wells that are here. There's thousands upon thousands of oil wells. And often when we talk about renewables, one of the issues is, how are we going to employ people? There's not as many jobs in these green energy sectors. And I admittedly often forget that there is this whole mess that we have to clean up as a nation, because a lot of these sites, they're still emitting. So they're still polluting the air, even though they're orphaned, they're still polluting the water and the land. And so that's something that we really must do in order to continue to combat climate change. Even if at the end of the day, we might, as I mentioned, end up losing some of these places, it's still important that we make sure to properly clean them so that the harm isn't continuing and continuing and continuing. I will say water really scares me, and that is one place where I don't know that I have really much hope for reclaiming that. I think it is quite terrifying, the amount of water that is used in the oil industry in such an arid place as we are. And we're not doing a great job of conserving our water. But what I've seen is that, leaders, governments are starting to look at ways of how are we going to clean this water? What limits are we going to push to allow water that maybe years ago we wouldn't have allowed to be a standard for, say, different things like farming, things like that? what are we going to allow? Because we're running out of water. It is being polluted by industry, and this is a really, really pressing problem. That scares me a lot, because I do know that the oil and gas industry, first of all, they're not having to report a lot of the chemicals that are in this fracking fluid, but then also there are studies coming out that there's PFAS, forever chemicals, in the water that they're fracking with, and we don't have a way to clean that. They're called forever chemicals for a reason, right? So that for me is something that I find very terrifying, and the fact that I could see maybe the goalpost moving for regulatory agencies. And already with young people, we're seeing these rising cancer rates, right? We're seeing a rise in colon cancer rates. This is all over the country. We're seeing a rise in breast cancer rates. And so young people are being faced with, not only climate change, but these health issues and the crumbling infrastructure that comes with all of these crises, piling up on top of each other. Our healthcare system, we saw it all struggle under COVID. I think it's still struggling in a lot of ways. So the water thing, I know I said it in a very roundabout way, that does give me a lot of worry. And I don't know if there's really much hope to reclaim that water if we're thinking realistically about the issue.
Thank you for your realism. Because in order to have, we have to have a realistic hope. So we need to be real. Yeah. Arcelia, and we're going to come back to everybody on all kinds of things. Arcelia, as people of faith, we have to bring to the table everybody, particularly those who've been historically left out. But how do we include everyone without overburdening them? You and I talked about this before a couple of weeks ago. How do we include people without overburdening them and without making them responsible for the problem, like solving the problem? So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that you are holding the space for all of us, and just honored to be with all these wonderful panelists that do such great work around the state. And yeah, this is something that, I grapple with a lot. And I think, having the context that Joan talked about, it took a lot of work to disenfranchise communities. It took a lot to create the structures that we have in place and are grappling with right now. And similarly, I think it's going to take a lot of work to counter that and to uplift people and create opportunities for people to use their voices. So, it's, not just, giving them resources, but it's also countering this culture of like dependency on these historically marginalizing industries. In our line of work, we have lots of conversations with people that have a lot of fear, like, oh, our families have been raised on these industries for generations. I'm scared of anything new coming in. And, there's this aspect of creating a lot of hope, right? To say like, oh, well, it doesn't have to, what if it's, something that can be more beneficial? What if it's something that can, be uplifting? What if it's something that can actually create more security in your community that you value so much? So like there's a lot of mining communities in Southwest New Mexico, and we've spoken with people there who are very resistant. Like they talk about how their communities are very resistant to having new renewable energy industries coming in. And just having conversations of like, oh, it's, not all at once. It's something that we want to start creating opportunities before there's a need to have to just abandon, because these are finite resources that are going to run out eventually. And, having these existing relationships goes a really long way, because whenever there is an opportunity for something new to come in, a new policy, a new, renewable energy project, in our case, that's something that we can come in and we can help facilitate that. So people sometimes are very interested in getting involved during the comment periods or sending in letters to the editor, or, whatever their engagement, like having their voices heard in some way, but they just don't have the physical capacity to do so. And so what I've been really happy to be able to do in my line of work is come in, and because we understand, what your priorities are, like this place cares about the agriculture and, water conservation, and whatever their priorities and their core values come from, that's where we can come in and tap in and help talk about that and draft things for them and say, like, here's some talking points, here's when this is happening, here are the timeframes, here's how you log into these awful outdated websites to get involved. You know,
Yes.
and it's a lot of work, and it's really difficult too, because when you go in and you build these relationships with people and gain trust and gain insight into, you know, what they care about, it's really hard to, you know, you just want to go in and do so much. And so it's going in with the understanding that it's going to be a lot of work for everyone involved, but really, it's just what's the nature of how we are right now. Like a lot of these communities that are very much primarily like people of color or like immigrant populations, like you don't see that reflected in leadership. And so you have to kind of go a little bit out of your way to make sure you're bringing people into the table and making sure that there's ways that we can help facilitate their voices being heard. But yeah, it's just something I think that would go a really long way to really make sure that, you know, you understand that it's a lot of work, because it's not just sending an email, sending a notice, or, you know,
Right.
there's always going to be classes of people that you're not reaching, and you're going to have to go in with the mindset of putting in the work to make sure that the information is communicated and that you're able to uplift and elevate those voices as we're going along.
Right. Yeah. When we're doing advocacy, we have to be in it for the long run, for the long haul, so to speak. Let me ask all of you, is there something else that you wanted to add to what you said, or something that you want to ask one of your colleagues? Because I know you all are colleagues. Something you want to pick up on that they said and add a little bit. So let me just put it out to you before we go through another round of questions.
Kaylee, I wanted you talked quite a bit about the air. Maybe could you just in a nutshell say some of the work that CCFF, Citizens Caring for the Future, has done, even from the beginning of the organizing. One of the concerns of the community there was more air monitoring, and then the air purifiers, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so one of the first things that Citizens Caring for the Future ever did when this tiny little community group got started, I was not a part of it yet, but New Mexico was in the process of making their methane rule that has now been, you know, it is now regulation, and it's one of the strongest rules in the country. And this little group of folks from our community that were concerned about the health impacts and what they were seeing happen into our air and our land during this most recent oil and gas boom, which really in this region started to take off and was in full swing around 2018. They actually went, there was a public meeting here in Carlsbad, and they went and gave comment in support of a strong methane rule. And this area, for kind of those that aren't familiar with it, the Permian Basin is Southeast Texas and then also West Texas. So it spans the two states. And if you're not familiar with New Mexico is a very liberal state, but there's a little corner of the state, the southeast corner, that is very, very conservative. And since 2016, since the Trump years, and then also I think having this industry, although I by no means think the industry is responsible for the extent of what we've seen here, there is quite a bit of political extremism in the area, and so standing up and speaking out is very difficult and can have you know, some really hefty prices with it. And so I just always talk about how incredibly brave it was for this group of people to stand up in an in-person meeting in our town and say, we want stricter regulation, we want the air to be cleaner. So that's one of the first things that Citizens Caring for the Future ever did. As I mentioned, New Mexico passed these nation-leading methane rules. Since then, we have always had a very big concern about enforcement of regulation on a federal level and a state level, just because we live here and we know that there's really little to no enforcement of this regulation going on. And for a long time, we could just see it with our eyes, right? And it was something that we could just talk about and mention, and there wasn't really the data to back it up. And we were very concerned about that. And we wanted to make sure that there was some kind of monitoring to really get a snapshot of what is happening in the region. And so we went to the New Mexico Environment Department and we asked them to enter a grant competition that the EPA was putting on to get an air monitor put in our region. We do have an ozone air monitor, But just for reference for folks, just a breakdown of the Permian, I mentioned that it's Southeast Texas and West.
Right.
Or go ahead.
Might need to make this a little brief in terms of
Okay.
their time. Yes.
Anyway, there's not a lot of air monitoring in the entirety of the Permian. It is very vast. So there's Southeast New Mexico, West Texas. In Southeast New Mexico, we have 3 ozone monitors. In West Texas, there is no ozone monitoring whatsoever. They're not monitoring it at all. And so we commissioned New Mexico Environment Department to put into a grant competition. We have got what's called a BTEX air monitor, which that will be monitoring volatile organic compounds that hurt human health, which is something that has not always been monitored and is not required by law for these agencies to monitor. Another thing, there's also a research project going on right now, and there's a very high level air monitor near Carlsbad that is measuring ozone, methane, volatile organic compounds, nitrous oxides. And we're really getting a snapshot of just how bad this pollution issue is. It's preliminary, but we were talking to the scientists last week, and some of the ozone readings are so high that their tools, their instruments can't actually measure that high. And so they're having to come in and calibrate it, recalibrate it, and make sure that that's actually correct. So that's a little bit of the work we've done. We've been involved in all those things. And sorry, I hope I shortened it enough.
Oh, thank you, Kaylee. Thank you. Right. That's scary to think that the monitors aren't even calibrated to note what really is happening. Right. What I'd like to do is to ask each of you, if there was one thing you could recommend that we could do, most of us are probably from outside the state of New Mexico, in order to support your efforts for advocacy, what is it that we could do? And Terry, I'd like to toss it to you first. What might we be able to do to help your efforts?
I think what people can do first is pray that we can get the strength and initiative and power to move forward on protecting our lands, air, and water, and of course working as a collective with our people, as was talked about also. But I think for Chaco and the region, to protect it, contact your federal senators and Congress people to tell them, first to pass the Chaco Cultural Heritage Area Protection Act, but also pay close attention to the needs of the people. A lot of the time what we're finding is that they're not listening to what the people are saying, because oil and gas has the $1 billion that sway, any discussion. But I think we're seeing it a little bit better, with Deborah Haaland in office, with our congressional delegation, and then with President Biden in office. But I think we really need to pressure the EPA and the BLM to listen to what the people want, because we're the ones that have to deal with it. We need to think in the native way. We think of 7 generations ahead, for the 7 generations. So we need to think ahead for those children and their children and their children. What are they going to have? What is the legacy we're going to leave them? So I think getting to an understanding and educating at that level too is going to be important. So that would help us by contacting our lawmakers that make those changes. And one other thing too on water, we need to watch out for produced water. That is a deadly. It is being hailed as the next thing to clean the water or use clean water, but it's dangerous as it's radioactive. So be careful with that too.
Right. And we will put some information in the follow-up email. First of all, anything that our panelists are discussing with us, that information will go in a follow-up email, and we'll make sure that there is some information about produced water. Kaylee, quickly.
I just wanted to bounce off of what Terry said, as I saw a question in the chat about directed towards me, saying that this person was reminded of how during the lockdowns brought clear waters to the canals in Venice. So is the lack of hope based on a belief that it's not physically possible to clean the water, or a lack of hope in humanity? It's not a lack of hope in humanity. It's a lack of hope in the ability to actually clean this water. As Terry mentioned, produced water can be radioactive. It's also filled with very dangerous chemicals, and we just do not have the technology or the expertise to clean it and we probably won't for decades.
And perhaps if we didn't produced water in the first place, we wouldn't have to worry about how do we clean it up. Sister Joan, I think you had something.
Yeah, I have, I want to follow off on Terry with prayer. I want to say awareness, deep awareness of our cosmic entanglement with one another, and that's we're one community. And so that there is no out there, when I step in my car, if it's a gas fueled car, I need to remember, think of the people in the Permian, or think of the Navajo around Chaco, that I'm connected with them. And with that, I would invite an action, and that would be to, and you'll get the link for this, but to very simply write the director of EPA, Michael Reagan, and say that they need to finalize very strong EPA rules on methane now. You don't have to say much more than that. They were supposed to have done this already. It keeps being pushed back. They just need reminded that people are watching. It needs to happen now. And as Kaylee mentioned, and Josie, methane pollution is very much contributing to climate. It's 86 times more potent than other sources of pollutants with greenhouse gases. So it's our community members, it's all of us.
Okay. And we will make sure that that information gets into the follow-up email. Want to make sure we have some time to hear from our participants. So Janine is our communications coordinator and has been collecting questions. And you're on, Janine.
Thank you so much, Louise. We have had a few questions come in, and I'll start with coming actually right off of what you just said, Joan. You had spoken earlier about faith, especially also, as you mentioned, Laudato Si and the doctrine of discovery, and now this EPA action. At this point, what contributions can faith communities make?
I think there is no limit to the difference that faith communities can make, actually. Another story. So recently I went to a informational meeting with the Bureau of Land Management. They also have new rules, regulations that they're forming, and they would like input on that. And that'll be one of the other actions people might do. But I went up to, they had information tables. I went to one of the tables. This gentleman said to me, after we had talked, he said, "Are you Sister Joan?" And I said, "Yes, I am." He says, "I heard you speak at a regulatory hearing a few years back." And I thought, oh my gosh. So whatever I said made some impression to him. It wasn't about me. It's whatever the issue was. I think we underestimate the voice of faith and how we talk about these concerns, that it's community, it's our brothers and sisters, that everything is sacred. We're all connected. And so I don't think there's any limit. Just jump in.
And I think I saw Arcelia and Josie just kind of shaking heads at that. Did either one of you want to add anything?
No, I think what was said was really, really all-encompassing. Sometimes we don't really see the value in using our voices in these spaces until they sometimes, occasionally, if we're lucky, find their way back to us in the form of, somebody reaching out. But yeah, it's just, that's what, a lot of my job has centered around, is really elevating people's voices. That's probably one of the single most valuable things that we can do during these times that are just so incredibly transitional and moving so quickly. Is just making sure that we're using all of our voices collectively and elevating the voices that haven't been historically brought to the table.
Thank you.
Josie, anything to add?
I just think it's important when we talk about advocacy to always remember that the most important voices in the conversation are the people who are living with these things outside of their home. I think it's important that we always hear from community members in the most, close and intimate way as we can. Personally, right now, I can look out my window and I can see several rigs, frac sites at my grandmother's home, which I largely consider to be my home as well. They're actually tearing open the earth and adding a 6th pipeline to the 5 that are already in her backyard. So I think when we talk about advocacy on any level, it's important important, where we gain our information from, and which steps and actions we follow, and make sure these are things that the community members are completely on board with and comfortable with, because I think it's important not to speak over the people that are living in these places and the way that they're feeling. And it's such a complex situation here in the Permian, and how the people feel about advocacy.
Thank you. Terry, piggybacking on what Josie was just saying, actually, I'm curious, how much representation do Native people have in the state of New Mexico, also in the federal government, and is it at all growing?
Well, in the state of New Mexico, I don't know the percentage. I think it's roughly, there's about 20% or 25% of the 20% of the population is Native American. So there's a huge voice here in New Mexico. When I do talk with groups on any issue, especially environmental issues, I tell them we need to speak up and say something, because we have a powerful voice. If we all voted, we could put somebody in office if we want to. And then to also follow up with what Josie was saying about voices, and then also community engagement and just saying something. I just recently helped stop an insecticide spray in northern New Mexico in Rio Chama. I got word from New Mexico State Senator Mimi Stewart that the spray was happening. And of course, I mobilized, pulled in Secretary Halden, pulled in Zocil Torres Small, pulled in our congressional delegation and then the environmental communities. And so we stopped the spray in like 6 days. We got it stopped by the BLM, the United States Department of Agriculture. So the power of your voice is there. We just got to activate it, use it, talk to the right people. I'm just lucky I have a lot of contacts, within the federal government and then various, of course, high places. But again, anybody can get that. Anybody can do that. It's just a matter of doing that. I'm an accredited member of the United Nations through my organization, Southwest Native Cultures. And I used to be on Secretary Ban Ki-moon's climate action team. So at that level, you have access to global perspectives in action. So it just takes the desire to do that, so we can get it done.
Thank you so much. Kaylee, I'm going to throw this question to you. I hope, if you can't answer it, be honest. But we've had a couple of people ask, what are the options to provide transitional energy sources? And actually, one person wrote, probably a topic for other webinars. However, what can you say to that?
I will say, I think I'm actually going to hand that question maybe over to Arcelia. I think she could answer it a little bit better than me. But I will kind of speak to the Permian. We're in a unique situation because we are the most active oil field. A lot of those opportunities don't really come to our door. And if they do, it's tied to more oil and gas development in some way. And so our challenge here is really, we have some of the biggest corporations in the world that are very heavily involved in our community. And a lot of the progress that we're seeing on a nationwide scale is not necessarily happening in our backyard. So what I would always ask of really anyone, something that helps the Permian is just to talk about what's going on here and to be aware of what's going on here. We're the only advocacy group of our kind in the entirety of the Permian Basin, and the Permian Basin is very large. So that just kind of gives you an idea of how little representation there is. But then go ahead, take it away. I think that you're better to answer this question.
It's always hard to follow you up, Kaylee, gotta say. No, but I think this is a very unique time. There's a lot of opportunities, especially with the recent passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. There's so many resources that are just going to be pouring into this extremely relatively new renewable energy, alternative energy industry. A lot of the work that we do is a lot of education on the need for improving our infrastructure. A lot of our existing transmission, for example, was built in the past 100 years and was built to accommodate a very different energy capacity than what we need today. So getting all of that updated and, on a more local level, because this is such a new industry, there's a lot of different ordinances and local regulations about what is allowed to be built in your area, or there's just no existing guidelines whatsoever. So things like that really can complicate bringing in alternative energy sources into any given area. So I would say just getting involved and knowing, what ordinances are in place, what are ways that who are the people that are being reached out to, and just making sure that as these resources are coming in from the Inflation Reduction Act, I think it's very important to really be monitoring and making sure that, is this being made accessible? Is this easy to reach on these government websites? Is it being translated? Is this being circulated to people that are not as connected to all of these different coalitions and all these wonderful groups that we are very lucky to be part of, and just having like that mindset of who can we still be reaching that maybe isn't being reached out to, and to making sure that there's accessibility in these resources, and that there's communication happening, and that there's already this foundation in place so that we can really build up this very quickly growing industry, and making sure that it's not just done quickly but also done equitably and in collaboration, in community along the way. And with that, I do have to step off for another meeting, but this has been absolutely wonderful. I'm honored to be here with you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time, Arcelia. We appreciate it.
Right.
We have just actually one more question, and it's directed to Terry. What are some components of a just transition for the folks you mentioned, the Alatis, who coming off of those oil and gas leases?
What are the components? I would think, I think first listening to them and what they have to say. I mean, what it is, that their concerns are. And I think a big issue is, for employment is a big issue, for those that are working in the oil and gas industry. When I actually worked on the Energy Transition Act with then Congresswoman Michelle Grisham, and then subsequent meetings and events, I brought in tribal consultation into the discussion. But I did research on the California solar industry, and what I learned is that with the solar industry, if you build a utility scale solar power plant, you can almost employ the same number of employees as a coal-fired power plant. So I think those things need to be brought into the picture as you transition, because we looked at how we would re-educate this workforce. It would just create some additional training on electronics, on the industry itself, and it's actually going to be higher paying jobs if you looked into a solar power plant. And so, if we had huge utility scale plants, I think it would be pretty awesome to have, in our region and rebuilt in those areas. And of course, it would address the global warming issue, but I guess, and then again, it would bring in employment. But then I think also part of the transition too is education and understanding. I think what we're seeing too is that there's a lot of misinformation that's being provided by the oil and gas industry. The NMOGA is our Mexican Oil and Gas Association. And so they're brainwashing these people to think a certain way without knowing that there's other alternatives, other realities. And so I think that's also going to be important, is educating on what is out there, what can we do to make changes, and then make the transition and the renewable energy real. No carbon credits, none of those things that should come into play. There needs to be real action on renewable energy. No playing this shuffling of whatever. That's the reality we really need to see happen.
Right.
Thank you.
Haley, you have a response?
Yeah, I just wanted to bounce off of Terry once again, mentioning the brainwashing that oil companies, are doing to people. And something that I just see so much nowadays, and that just seems to be more and more prevalent, is the greenwashing from these major oil companies. And just a little story. Yesterday, I was watching the local New Mexico news, and a commercial came up for here in Carlsbad, we have the Mayor's Energy Summit. And what that is basically just a big party for oil and gas that our mayor and our city host every year. They talked through what it is and all that thing, but the very last photo that is on the presentation is a big solar farm, a guy just walking through a big solar farm. And it's just really interesting what is happening. And I think it's something we all need to be aware of in terms of the energy sources that are being funded. Things like hydrogen are very, very concerning, and just a way that the fossil fuel industry is going to be up even further. So that's all I want to say there.
Joan, you want to wrap us up with one more comment?
Well, just about this, because it's huge, the energy transition and moving into the future, the right now in the future. So just jumping off from Terry and also Kaylee, I think for those folks on the call who are advocates, when we're advocating for different pieces of legislation, I think that there needs to be within them accounting for these transitions of jobs, employment, the health of people, clean up, all of those things. And that is not always forefront. But in terms of environmental justice in these areas in our communities, that has to be part of advocacy in those pieces of legislation. So just as an example, the federal level right now, there's concern about the budget. And probably what's going to happen is negotiations for more subsidies for oil and gas, rather than saying we're not going to go there. Instead, we need to be putting money into transition for workers and workers' health and the implications of this industry. So just in terms of policy and advocacy and creating legislation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our panelists. And at this point, I am going to toss it to David Buer for our closing prayer. Take it away, David.
I was reflecting on what to pray, what to offer for a prayer this afternoon. And yesterday during morning prayer, we came across Psalm 67 in our morning prayer from the Divine Office. So I'd like to offer that psalm. And if for those who would like to, the response to each stanza will be, "Let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you." So if you'd like to join in, then feel free. O God, be gracious and bless us, and let your face shed its light upon us. So will your ways be known upon earth, and all nations learn your saving help. Let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. Let the nations be glad and exult, for you rule the world with justice. With fairness you rule the peoples. You guide the nations on earth. Let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. The earth has yielded its fruit, for God our God has blessed us. May God still give us God's blessing, till the ends of the earth revere the Creator. Let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. And loving God, we ask your blessing upon our humble efforts to protect our Mother Earth. Thank you for the many gifts that you give to us, and please guide us along the way and give us the strength that we need. I like to ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Father David. Thank you to our panelists. We're so grateful for your activism, for your presence with us, for all the things that we have learned from you. Thank you. Thanks to everyone who has joined us here. We have a number of things that we're pretty excited about in terms of actions that are coming up and events that are coming up. You will get all this information. You do not have to, I guess you can take a picture of it with your camera if you like, but you don't have to. We'll make sure you get this information. About September 5th, 17th, some of you may be involved in this, particularly if you're in the New York area. There is a march to end fossil fuels. September 21st, SPAN is doing a Ukraine listening session. On October 1st, a virtual transitus of St. Francis. On October 13th to the 16th, it's our first annual Franciscan Justice Leadership Conference here in DC. October 24th will be the second of our Working for Environmental Justice, and we'll be focusing on Rise St. James Parish in Louisiana. And on November 15th is the third of the Working for Environmental Justice webinar in Chester, PA. You see the advocacy actions on the right. We will make sure you get the link to a petition for Rise St. James, for comments to the Bureau of Land Management, to protect New Mexico public lands, and to protect Chaco Canyon Action Alert. Check your email. We'll be sending you action alerts on a regular basis as they arise. And we are so grateful to have everybody here with us tonight. And for all of you who will be listening on a recording, we are grateful for you too. Thank you for being with us. We hope to see you soon. Peace.
Thank you.
Thank you all.